Marshall D. Teach, or Blackbeard, as many of you know him, is officially here as a leader in the One Piece TCG, and we knew he was coming based on the information that Bandai provided us. We just didn't know he would come out swinging this hard. And I wanted to talk about the leader today, explore how I think its effect is a bit of a problem when it comes to the One Piece TCG, and I think how the design of leaders like this can ultimately lead to a net negative in terms of play patterns, play design, and where the future of this game is going. I'm going to talk about it from all aspects of how we build this leader, some of the support it may or may not already have, and how it affects the rest of the metagame of leaders that are played at the top. And of course, if you have your preconceived notions about this leader, I want to hear about it in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear about it, and then maybe at the end of the video, after I've done my talking here, maybe you can edit it and double down, or maybe provide your renewed sense of vigor or hate for a card like this. Of course, if you want to see me have more discussions like this, leave a like on the video. Let me know what you want me to talk about, but let's talk about it from the leader first. Let's talk about abilities. Marshall D. Teach is a black leader with 4 Emperors Blackbeard Pirate type with 5 life and 5k. So regular templating when it comes to monocolored leaders, which is nice. And it says your on-play abilities don't activate. So immediately you don't get access to some of the staples that black already has as a kind of way to gain advantage in this leader. So we're going to talk about that in a second. And then activate main, you may trash 1 card from your hand until the end of your opponent's turn. Your opponent's on-play abilities don't activate. So this is going to be a leader built around card disadvantage, so we can talk about how maybe there are ways to take advantage of that, but ultimately this is going to be a hopefully symmetrical prison piece, as you, the Blackbeard player, want to stop your on-play abilities that may have negative effects, or you want to stop your opponent's on-play abilities that have positive effects. I'm thinking of cards that on-play draw a card, on-play return a card, on-play do anything, right? Anything that you want to stop on play, which honestly the majority of the game is. If you think about your average game of the One Piece TCG, how many on play effects have your opponent used against you? They've cheated out, they've used to top deck a card, return it to the bottom, put it to your head, like all these effects. How many of them are on play abilities? I mean, especially when it comes to playing against blue, a lot of that exists in that color. So this is going to be a leader that's very polarizing and really going to change the way that we play this game. So let's talk about it from the top here in terms of what it can and can't do here. I want to talk about Sabo, which I think highlights 2 problems that this leader has. So firstly, Sabo being a black staple, a card that is really expensive and just really valuable in terms of what it can do. It provides card selection, not card draw. Card draw implies that you add cards to your hand. Sabo does not do that. Sabo provides selection and provides interaction between what you can and can't have in your hand and what you want to dig for. Takes out dead cards, adds hopefully good cards to your hand from your deck, and goes net negative on its card advantage. You have to spend Sabo to then just kind of switch around the cards in your hand. You are ultimately losing a card, which honestly might be good for Blackbeard because you don't want to play a card like this necessarily. You lose its on-play effect, and this is a black staple that other black decks are already playing. You're then going to be losing cards like Rebecca, which is another black staple, Rob Lucci in terms of removal. You don't have the traditional effects that make black good as a color, and black is traditionally not a color that's good at card draw. Look at a deck like Sakazuki that has selection built into its leader that sometimes can play effects like Hina to draw cards. It can play stuff like Sanji's Pilaf, which lists have played 1 to 2 copies of throughout, to add cards, add more options into a deck like that. And so the other color is really powerful. Otherwise, you're going to be primarily working in a removal and advantage in abilities like Sabo that prevent KO effects. And so you're not going to get any of that. So how do you build a leader like this? I mean, firstly, just off of its baseline, just stopping your opponent's stuff is going to be really powerful. So against anything yellow, literally Katakuri, NL, 90% of blue decks cooked, right? They are completely reliant on their on-play effects. So just being able to stop every single big mom out there, every single Charlotte Lin out there, a lot of yellow in general against, again, the whole NL and Katakuri package is absolutely cooked because they cannot have on-play effects. Look at cards like Gidatsu, look at cards like Yamato. Look at their 1-cost searchers. I mean, at a baseline, 1-cost searchers, 2-cost searchers, any searcher, generally speaking, is on play. There are a few that are activate main, especially I'm thinking of the ones in green. They are activate main abilities, but no one can affect those. No one can gain any advantage from those. They are just dead cards that you play. And well, I mean, they could be counters in your hand, which is also fair. I imagine a deck like this is going to want to swing wide because it probably is going to be built around effects that have a lot of negative effects that you want to not have happen on play, so that other black leaders don't take advantage of them, because the on-play effects are going to be so bad for you. So now this deck is going to be able to take advantage of them, but they might be actually very well statted because of their negative effect, and so they might be swinging very large at you. So honestly, it might even out in the sense that you might not play these on-play effects and hold them back in your hand as counters. Now obviously this is not going to happen with something like 10 cost Mom. I'm thinking of a lot of the cheaper stuff that does still have counters on it, but it's going to cook a lot of decks. So on its baseline, it's going to have that prison element that's going to already give you those advantages, but that also means that your opponent's probably going to have on average more cards in hand, so it's going to be harder for you to swing out early, but you do want to get out and get aggressive. Now when it comes to comparing this to other leaders, right, so you have stuff like Imperial Vankov that has this static ability that says at the end of your turn you have 0 cards in your hand, you draw 2 cards. These are things that provide you advantage, passive value, and you still have to work with cards in your deck. The thing I don't like about Martial D Teach is the fact that it's a prison element stapled onto a leader that kind of builds itself. If you know, eventually we're going to see the way OP09 cards kind of land out, there's no counterplay to this. This isn't a Gion that's played against Nami that you can Gravity Blade. This is an effect that's going to happen on turn 1, on turn 10, on turn 15, whatever it might be. It's going to be an ability that you always have to contend with, which I think is a problem, because what stops this from having other prison elements in the game? What happens when we start getting Gion on a leader that whenever your opponent activates an event, then they have to kind of bottom deck a card? Whenever you know, your opponent can't activate on play abilities, your opponent can't play more than 1 character a turn, your opponent can't attack with more than 1 character a turn, your opponent can't activate blocker abilities. Like, what happens when we start getting effects like this stapled onto leaders, taking the card design outside of the characters, taking the deck building restrictions outside of the characters, and just building it all onto the leader? I think this kind of started with the Yamato type leaders, where having double attack on a leader is absolutely bonkers, and thankfully double attack is built in such a way where if you double attack for lethal and they still have a life, you don't actually deal that lethal point of damage. If they have 1 life, you're just going to deal 1 damage, and then you have to deal it again. So double attack is inherently built in with a sense of downside, which is nice. It has that restriction to it, but this doesn't. This just universally says you have this prison element, you can't stop it, you can't interact it, and I think that is a frustrating thing with this card. That is where a card like this is really going to be oppressive, even with the inherent elements of card disadvantage in a color that can't really draw cards that well, loses its selection because it really has a lot of that in its on-play effects. I'm imagining we're going to see a lot of support for a color like this, especially with such an anticipated leader, such an anticipated character that has to live up to the hype of its power in the anime. So highlighting that Imperial Vankov, even though it draws cards, doesn't do anything inherently busted in it. Its color and its cards impel down build around this to work around the advantage cards like Deathwing, cards like the Ivankov, or like cards like 7 cost Ivankov, cards like Inazuma, like all these cards that build around Imperial work around its ability and play into it. It doesn't all get built around its leader and you play cards around it. You play the leader and then you play characters that, you know, work with themselves to build out the leader's ability. Whereas when it comes to something like Blackbeard, you have the leader's ability and you play all in on it. You play all in, nothing else. You want to stop your opponent from playing anything. If they have an activated minion ability, you're gonna play a lot of removal to remove that. Heck, you're gonna be again playing cards like 10 cost Kuzan, which again have that static ability that you're probably not gonna be able to search for lore wise. I mean, imagine Blackbeard can search for something like Kuzan. It wouldn't really make sense thematically, but cards like that you want activated main abilities, you want static abilities that are going to be played in the deck. And so these are the type of abilities that are going to press your opponent out of this game, reducing costs, playing removal, and there's maybe just swinging a bunch of times at your opponent with your leader. They're going to have, again, a lot more cards in hand on average, and I think it's going to lead to bad play patterns because your opponent is going to be playing cards. They're going to be frustrated with a lot of dead cards in their hand. And really, a lot of leaders are just going to be playing in and out in terms of viability because of the fact that a leader like this can just be around. You can walk into your locals, there's 10 players, 5 of them are Martial D Teach, and then all of a sudden you're sitting there as a yellow player like 50% of the time, I'm not going to be able to play the game. Right? 50% of these games, I'm not going to be able to play the game, which I think is going to lead to a lot more frustrating play patterns than just playing against Nami. But I want to compare this to an effect that exists in Magic the Gathering called Teferi Time Raveler. Now, Teferi Time Raveler, for those of you that play Magic, understand its oppression. It says each opponent can only cast spells anytime they would cast a sorcery. So for those of you that don't know Magic the Gathering, there is an inbuilt stack system that's very intricate that allows you to interact with your opponent at any point in the game. Any point in the game, you can cast a spell and interact with your opponent if the spell allows you to do so, if it has instant as a type, right? So think of a counter event that you can activate at any point that's not restricted to just combat. And that's how One Piece balances itself. You have quote unquote instant speed spells, but those only work in combat. So they have counter on them and they're siloed into a specific phase of the game, whereas Magic the Gathering doesn't have that. And Teferi Time Raveler stops you from doing that. You as a controller stops your opponent from being able to do that at all. Now Teferi notably isn't symmetrical because you play this in a control deck where your opponents play things out at sorcery speed on their turn, but you counter that spell, you interact, you remove it, do whatever, but your opponent can't respond to it. Right? And so that's where something like Teferi comes into play, but there's counterplay to this because you can counter this spell. It costs 3. You can play aggressive decks that go under it, where when your opponent plays this on turn 3, they tap out to play this. You don't care as an aggressive deck because you can attack into it, you can circumvent it, you can just ignore it because you're going for lethal. Like Teferi has a lot of deck building restrictions to it, or a lot of cost restrictions to playing a card like this. You're playing this in control decks sometimes, in mid-range decks, but you actually have to find an opening to do so, or if you just tap out and do this, your opponent's then just going to do whatever because they know that you don't have interaction, they don't have counter spells. You could just combo off, you could just play something big and that Teferi can't deal with. You could attack into it, whatever. Teferi has deck building restrictions, whereas Martial D Teach is always out on the battlefield. You start with it on turn 0, on turn 5, on turn 10, on turn 15, whatever. You as the opponent always has to deal with the static effect of your on-play abilities not working at all, which I think is a problem when it comes to effects like Teferi. A lot of people in Magic the Gathering are upset with a card like Teferi. I personally have come across that as well. Teferi is a very frustrating card when your opponent is able to play it and then capitalize on it. Being able to play their sorcery speed spells at instant speed is also very frustrating. Card draw, everything. There's so many things that this card does that honestly Martial D Teach doesn't, but I think is a negative play pattern that we can learn from, that we don't need to be providing to our One Piece leaders. Now, as a Nami player, I do want to address this as well, because a lot of leaders will see Nami as a frustrating leader to play against. And I think honestly, you suck at the game if you generally get salty against Nami players. I honestly think you're a bad One Piece player. If you generally get that upset at playing against Nami, it's a skill issue, and you just need to get better at the game. This is the most unique leader in the game. It's the most skill testing leader in the game, and that is objective fact, right? It is the only unique leader in the game in its win condition, the fact that it is functionally a combo deck, and this is the type of design that we should be pushing. We should be pushing alternate win conditions, combo leaders, and expanding the breadth of the game to provide different options. Right now, the game is so hyper-focused around combat that the game doesn't have any space to explore. There's no differences in the cards that you have access to, which is why cards like 5-cost Queen, 5-cost Sabo, Porcelino, like all these cards are so expensive in what they can do. Right? They're so expensive because they're the only cards that can do those, that can have these effects. Whereas Nami plays a lot of these unique cards that a lot of these leaders don't play, which is why they're cheap. And so because a leader like this can be frustrating, it doesn't matter because it's an alternate win condition. It's stuck into its tiny hole of card design. So it loses to itself. A lot of times Nami, you could play perfectly and still lose the game. That is the downside with this leader. You ultimately have to rely on your triggers or rely on the variance and the card decisions that you make get moment to moment. And that's why a card like this is balanced. But a card like the Martial D Teach isn't, because it's just a static ability that again starts at turn 0 and affects your opponent from the beginning of the game. And I think there's a lot of downside to it. I've already discussed it, the card disadvantage, the fact that it's monocolored, the fact that you lose a lot of black staples. But I think a lot of people are going to be able to get away with free wins because as a leader, it comes down and prevents your opponent from playing the game, whereas Nami doesn't do that. Nami doesn't prevent your opponent from playing the game. Nami wants to do that by playing events and stopping attacks, but it doesn't inherently do that. And that is why Nami is fine and balanced as a leader. It is designed to do so. It obviously limits blue card design in the space. They've had to leader lock a lot of the cards, and that's fine. But you can do that. You can make design that does that to play around Nami as an effect. I think black will now change as a color because of A, wanting to support Martial D Teach, and then B, having to kind of work around on-play effects, negative effects, and now you're going to have a lot of cards that don't play in a martial DT that work in other leaders, and so that leader is going to suffer because of it. But speaking of card design around it, I want to talk about Madness as a mechanic in Magic the Gathering and how this could be a potential way to access the full potential of martial DT. Now, Madness is an effect in Magic the Gathering that says, you know, you have a base cost for spells, right? Right now, this costs red, and 1. You have a base cost 3 mana to cast this spell, but if you were to discard a card from your hand and you chose this card to discard, then you can cast the spell for its Madness cost instead. If you were to discard this card, you can now turn it into Advantage, and this card now essentially it's 3 mana to deal 3 damage, or you could spend 1, which is more on rate. You could spend 3 mana to deal any damage, 3 damage to any target, and so that is how Madness, I think, could potentially be introduced in the 4 Emperors, the OP09 set. I think that could be a very powerful way to create advantage in a deck like this, whereas we see this in kind of Eggman, where we can Eggman type decks with Vegapunk, where we pay Dawn and add cards to the top of our life once a turn, starting off a very low life, but then a lot of those times those life cards that we add have trigger effects that trigger if you have an Eggman type leader or have really powerful yellow triggers, and that's the way they balance that leader. And then we could probably see this in here where maybe we have some discard effects where we now add them, where we add discard, where we can play cards out for a lot cheaper. Maybe a card is 5 Dawn, but if you were to discard it, you could play it right then for like 3. That could be a way that we see card design expand in a color like black. Now, obviously, this could break the game because there are a lot of leaders out there. There's a lot of effects out there that require you to discard cards, and then cheating them out now in black might be a bit of a problem. But again, this is a design space that we could see explored with something like Martial DT, because without proper levels of support, we are going to see a card like this just not succeed at all. Another aspect I want to explore is RG Jacinto talked about. Now, imagine if a card like Life from Loam became Blackbeard support. Mill 3 cards, return 3 target cards from your trash to hand. Now, this is a little hyperbole. This isn't mill 3 cards. Jed's 3 is a lot more complicated than that. Dredge is a replacement effect for your draw. You choose not to draw and instead mill 3 cards, which is very different, right? But obviously some of the templating could change. So you mill 3 cards and then return 3 characters from your trash to your hand. That is absolutely insane. First of all, we should not have that, right? We should not be able to return 3 character cards from our trash to our hand. Maybe like 1, maybe 2. But we don't need Moria decks becoming absolutely more insane than they need to, okay? So we need to remove the ability for decks like that to have access to things like that. But this could be a potential way that, again, we see Blackbeard gain support in a Dredge-like mechanic, in a Madness-like mechanic. And I think it could be really interesting outside of just forcing activate main abilities and static abilities like Kuzan. We don't need to just expand that. We could go into different styles of mechanics to then force that and see how they play out, not only in Blackbeard, but in other Black X leaders, monocolored Black X, whatever it might be. Type leaders. And I think this could help expand the design space of black as a color, which could be a net positive, although the leader may not be a net positive in general. And I think that's where I ultimately land with this leader. I think that without support, the leader is going to be absolutely trash, right? Because it has a whole lot of card disadvantage. It has a prison piece, but then it needs to move beyond that. It needs to actually play out a board, and you're going to be attacking into it. They're going to be losing cards out of their hand, and they're ultimately going to have turns where they're not going to be able to use the activate main ability, which is going to open you up to then being able to play your own on-play abilities on that turn. So I think without some type of card advantage, some way to cheat out cards, without support like that, this leader is going to be bad. But if there is support like that, this leader is going to be absolutely insane. It's going to be meta defining. It's going to change the way you build decks. It's going to change the viability of different leaders altogether and really provide a whole shift when it comes to the One Piece TCG meta. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below after all of that. Let me know if you had your opinion at the beginning of the video, edit it, and let me know if you're doubling down, if you think the leader is good or bad, or if you've changed your opinion into whether or not the leader is good or bad. I think this is going to be a very interesting leader. It's going to change the way One Piece is played, but I'm also very scared about what this could happen, what this could mean for the other leaders, the other 4 emperors, and how they're going to be designed. You know, how is Shanks going to be designed? How is Luffy going to be designed? Like, how the other leaders in that set are going to be designed, the colors, and how they're going to be added and kind of integrated in, and how we could see effects in the colors, blue, yellow, red, whatever, like all these colors change in the way that they play out, because I think this is kind of color pie breaking. This is adding a new effect. Is black going to be the prison color in the One Piece TCG? Because that's going to add a whole new swath of problems for the game itself in terms of its design. But we'll have to see as OP09 spoilers come out. And hopefully, as I release this video, hopefully more spoilers haven't come out, because I would really like to address them hopefully later down the line, because I definitely want to talk about where Marshall D. Teach ends up in this game.